The fork clattered against the hardwood floor, echoing through the sudden silence that had fallen over my mother's pristine dining room. I stared down at it, my cheeks burning with humiliation as 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me. The delicate china place settings gleamed under the crystal chandelier, each one perfectly arranged around the mahogany table that had been in our family for 3 generations. Every seat was occupied, except one. Mine. Because apparently there wasn't room for me at my own family's Thanksgiving dinner. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Just grab a plate from the kitchen, Becca. My sister Jennifer called out cheerfully, as if asking me to eat standing up in the corner was the most natural thing in the world. There's plenty of counter space by the window. Her voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that made cruelty sound like kindness, exclusion feel like accommodation. I bent to retrieve the fork, my hand trembling slightly as I gripped the silver handle. Around the table, conversations resumed as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just been relegated to the status of an unwelcome guest at the very gathering I'd driven 3 hours to attend. The turkey sat golden and magnificent at the center of the table, surrounded by dishes I'd helped prepare since dawn, while I stood there clutching my plate like a beggar waiting for scraps. This wasn't how Thanksgiving was supposed to be, this wasn't how family was supposed to treat family, but then again I'd been learning that lesson in painful increments for most of my adult life. The morning had started with such promise. I'd awakened in my cozy bedroom on Maple Street, autumn sunlight streaming through the lace curtains I'd hung just last month. The restored colonial house around me hummed with the quiet contentment that comes from a life built deliberately, brick by brick, choice by careful choice. Michael was already downstairs making coffee, and I could hear Tyler and Emma giggling over some shared secret in the kitchen below. We'd packed the car with covered dishes and genuine excitement. Emma had insisted on bringing the handmade place cards she'd crafted for everyone, her careful 7-year-old handwriting spelling out each family member's name in purple marker. Tyler had wrapped the bottles of wine Michael and I had selected from the local vineyard, treating each one like precious cargo. They were so eager to see their grandparents, their aunt and uncle, to be part of the warm family gathering they'd been promised. The drive through Connecticut's winding roads had been beautiful, the maple trees ablaze in shades of gold and crimson. We'd played silly car games and sung along to the radio, the kind of easy family joy that makes you believe the world is fundamentally good. Even when we'd hit traffic near Hartford, nobody complained. We were going home for Thanksgiving. We were going to be together. But the moment we'd pulled into my mother's circular driveway, I'd felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach. The house loomed before us, all Georgian columns and perfectly manicured landscaping, every blade of grass precisely trimmed, every flower bed mathematically arranged. It was beautiful in the way museums are beautiful, impressive, important, and utterly uninviting. Patricia Collins had answered the door wearing her trademark smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She'd hugged Tyler and Emma with genuine warmth, exclaiming over how tall they'd grown, how beautiful Emma's dress was, how handsome Tyler looked in his little button-down shirt. But when she'd turned to me, the smile had dimmed slightly, becoming something more dutiful than joyful. "Rebecca, you made it," she'd said, as if my arrival was somehow surprising despite the fact that we'd confirmed our attendance weeks ago. "I hope the traffic wasn't too terrible." She'd glanced briefly at the dishes in my hands, the homemade cranberry sauce and green bean casserole I'd spent hours perfecting, before gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen. "Just set those anywhere." The house had been bustling with activity. Jennifer was orchestrating the final meal preparations with military precision, her catering friend Amanda working alongside her to ensure everything was Instagram perfect. David was in the living room with my father, both men nursing whiskeys and discussing the stock market with the kind of casual authority that comes from never having worried about money. The dining room table was already set for 12, the good china gleaming, fresh flowers arranged just so. I'd counted the place settings twice, my heart sinking a little more with each pass. 12 settings, 12 chairs. But there were 13 of us, including Amanda, who'd apparently been invited to stay for dinner as thanks for her help with the meal preparation. "Mom," I'd said quietly, finding her in the kitchen arranging dinner rolls in a silver basket, "I think we might be short a place setting." She'd looked up at me with mild surprise, as if the thought hadn't occurred to her. "Oh, are we? Let me think." She'd counted on her fingers, murmuring names under her breath. "Your father and me, Jennifer and David, you and Michael the children, Uncle Frank and Aunt Carol and Amanda. That's 11, 12. She'd paused, her brow furrowing slightly. "Oh, I see. Well, I'm sure we can figure something out." But apparently figuring it out meant asking me to eat standing up while everyone else enjoyed the civilized comfort of a proper seat. As I'd stood there in the kitchen, plate balanced awkwardly in one.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Hand, fork in the other, watching my family enjoy their meal through the archway, the full weight of my position in this hierarchy had crystallized with painful clarity. I wasn't really family here, I was an obligation, a duty to be endured rather than a daughter to be celebrated. The worst part wasn't even the standing. It was the way everyone had accepted it so readily, as if my comfort and dignity were expendable luxuries rather than basic considerations. Jennifer hadn't even looked guilty when she'd suggested the kitchen counter. My mother had nodded approvingly, as if the solution was both obvious and appropriate. Even Michael had seemed uncertain about whether to protest, his loyalties torn between his wife and the desire to avoid creating a scene. I'd taken a bite of the turkey I'd helped prepare, the meat turning to sawdust in my mouth as I watched my children eat at the table where I apparently didn't belong. Emma kept glancing back at me with confused eyes, clearly not understanding why Mommy was eating by herself in the kitchen like the help. Tyler had started to offer me his chair, bless his generous heart, but I'd quickly shaken my head. I wouldn't let my children sacrifice their comfort for my humiliation. The conversations at the table flowed around topics that didn't include me. Jennifer dominated the discussion with stories about her latest real estate successes, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. David chimed in with market insights and vacation plans. My parents beamed with pride at their successful daughter and son-in-law, their voices warm with approval and affection. From my position by the kitchen window, I felt like a ghost haunting my own family gathering, present but not really there. Visible but not truly seen. The autumn light streaming through the glass seemed to mock me, highlighting my isolation in golden afternoon rays. It was then that Amanda, Jennifer's catering friend, emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh basket of rolls. She was a petite woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, probably around my age, with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to managing events and making people comfortable. She'd glanced around the dining room, taking in the elegant table setting and the assembled family, before her gaze landed on me standing awkwardly by the window. Her expression had shifted slightly, a small frown creasing her forehead as she processed the scene. "Excuse me," she'd said, addressing the table in general but looking specifically at my mother. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to make sure we had proper seating arranged. Where would you like the restaurant chain owner to sit? I can easily pull up another chair to the table." The silence that followed was deafening. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every fork paused halfway to waiting mouths. The grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick louder in the sudden quiet, marking seconds that stretched like hours. Restaurant chain owner. The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a spotlight suddenly illuminating truths that had been hidden in comfortable shadows. My mother's face had gone pale, then flushed pink with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. There's no restaurant owner here." Amanda's confusion was genuine and immediate. She gestured toward me with a slight smile. "Oh, I apologize. I assumed she was the owner of that restaurant chain. Thompson's right. Jennifer mentioned she was successful in the food industry, and when I saw her standing rather than sitting at the table, I just figured she must be someone very important who was too busy overseeing things to sit down. The misunderstanding was innocent enough. Thompson's was indeed a popular restaurant chain throughout New England, known for their farm-to-table approach and family-friendly atmosphere. The coincidence of my married name had created a perfectly reasonable assumption, but the implication of Amanda's words hit the room like a physical force. She'd assumed I was standing because I was important, not because I was unwelcome. She'd assumed I was someone worthy of special consideration, not someone whose comfort was disposable. She'd assumed I was the kind of person who commanded respect, not someone who could be casually relegated to eating alone in the kitchen. Jennifer's face had cycled through several shades of red as she'd processed the situation. "Oh no, that's just my sister Rebecca, she's not. I mean, she doesn't own." Her voice had trailed off as she'd realized there was no way to explain my standing position without revealing the ugly truth of it. "Your sister." Amanda's voice had risen with shock and something that might have been outrage. "You're making your sister eat standing up. During Thanksgiving dinner." She'd looked around the table as if seeing it clearly for the first time, taking in the empty spaces that could have easily accommodated another chair, the abundance of room that made my exclusion a choice rather than a necessity. The shame that had settled over the dining room was almost tangible. Uncle Frank had cleared his throat uncomfortably and stared down at his plate. Aunt Carol had shot a sharp look at my mother that spoke volumes about her opinion of the arrangements. Even David, who usually maintained a studied neutrality in family matters, had shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But it was my children's faces that had broken my heart completely. Emma's lower lip had started to tremble as she'd finally understood why Mommy wasn't sitting with everyone else. Tyler had pushed back from the table slightly, his young face flushed with an indignation he was too young to fully articulate, but old enough to feel deeply. "It's fine," I'd said quickly, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions churning in my chest. "Really, I don't mind standing." But Amanda hadn't let it go. With the kind of directness that comes from someone unencumbered by family politics and old grudges, she'd addressed my mother directly. "Mrs. Collins, I'm sure this is just an oversight. Let me get another chair from the living room. There's plenty of space at the table." "That's not necessary." My mother had replied stiffly, her voice tight with the control she'd always wielded like a weapon. "Rebecca is perfectly comfortable where she is." "Actually," Michael had said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "she's not." He'd stood up from his chair, his movements deliberate and calm, "and neither am I." He'd gathered his plate and walked over to where I stood, settling beside me against the kitchen counter. "We'll eat here together." The gesture had been simple, but its impact had been profound. In choosing to stand with me rather than remain seated in comfort, Michael had drawn a line in the sand. He'd made a statement about loyalty, about love, about what it meant to be a real partner. He'd shown our children what it looked like to stand up for someone you love, even when it meant sacrificing your own comfort. Tyler and Emma had immediately started to follow their father's example, scrambling down from their chairs with their plates in hand. But I'd stopped them gently, kneeling down to their level despite the awkwardness of my position. "You two stay at the table with Grandma and Grandpa," I'd said softly, brushing Emma's hair behind her ear. "Mommy and Daddy are fine here, we want you to enjoy your dinner." But the damage was done. The comfortable fiction that had allowed my family to treat me as less than equal had been shattered by an outsider's innocent assumption. Amanda's words had held up a mirror to the gathering, and the reflection had been ugly enough to make everyone squirm. The rest of the meal had passed in strained politeness, conversations forced and laughter hollow. Amanda had tried several more times to convince someone to bring another chair to the table, her discomfort with the situation evident in every word. But my family had closed ranks around their decision, defending the indefensible with the kind of stubborn pride that values appearance over truth. As I'd stood there eating my Thanksgiving dinner like a servant in my own family's home, something fundamental had shifted inside me. The humiliation was still there, sharp and bitter, but underneath it was growing something else. Something that felt like clarity. Like resolve. Like the first stirrings of a long overdue awakening. For years I'd accepted my position in this family hierarchy. I'd swallowed the small slights and casual dismissals, telling myself that keeping the peace was worth the price of my dignity. I'd convinced myself that family meant enduring whatever treatment was offered, that love required accepting crumbs when others feasted on full meals. But standing there in that kitchen, watching my husband choose solidarity over comfort, seeing my children's confusion at the unfairness they were witnessing, I finally understood something that should have been obvious years ago. This wasn't love. This wasn't family. This was something much smaller and meaner, dressed up in the language of tradition and obligation, and I was done with it. The drive home from my mother's house that evening was unnaturally quiet. Tyler and Emma had fallen asleep in their car seats within minutes of leaving the driveway, exhausted by the emotional weight of a day they were too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel with unusual tension, his jaw set in a way that told me he was processing everything that had happened with the same mixture of anger and disbelief that was churning in my own chest. The Connecticut countryside rolled past our windows in shades of purple and gray, the autumn twilight painting everything in soft shadows. Normally, this would have been my favorite part of any family visit, the peaceful drive home with satisfied children, and the warm glow of time well spent. Instead, I felt hollow, scraped raw by hours of forced smiles, and swallowed pride. I should have said something earlier. Michael finally broke the silence, as we merged onto the highway. His voice was tight with regret. I should have demanded they bring another chair the moment I realized what was happening. I reached over and placed my hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. You couldn't have known they would be so stubborn about it. I didn't expect it either. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. Part of me had expected exactly this kind of treatment. I'd grown so accustomed to being an afterthought in my own family, that I'd walked into that house already braced for some form of dismissal. What I hadn't expected was how painful it would be to have my children witness it, or how clearly an outsider would see the cruelty that I'd learned to normalize. That woman Amanda, she was horrified, Michael continued, his voice growing stronger. Did you see her face when she realized Jennifer was making her own sister eat standing up? She looked like she'd stumbled into some kind of medieval punishment. The memory of Amanda's genuine shock still stung. Her assumption that I must be someone important, someone worthy of deference and respect, had highlighted just how far I'd fallen in my own family's estimation. She'd seen a successful woman standing apart from a dinner table, and assumed it was by choice, a mark of status rather than a sign of rejection. Restaurant chain owner, I murmured, almost laughing at the irony. She thought I was too important to sit down. Maybe she wasn't wrong about the important part, Michael said quietly. Maybe she just misunderstood why they were treating you differently. We pulled into our own driveway just as the street lights were flickering on along Maple Street. Our house looked warm and welcoming after the formal coldness of my mother's Georgian mansion, light spilling from the windows onto the front porch where I'd hung autumn wreaths just last week. This was home. This was where people valued me not for my compliance, but for my presence. Michael carried Emma upstairs, while Tyler stumbled sleepily to his room, still clutching the leftover dinner roll he'd insisted on bringing home. I stood in our front hallway for a moment, breathing in the familiar sense of home, vanilla candles and coffee and the faint lingering aroma of the pumpkin bread I'd made earlier in the week. My phone buzzed against my hip. A text message from Jennifer. Hope you had a good time today. Sorry things were a little crowded at the table. Maybe next year we should do a buffet style so people can eat wherever they're comfortable. I stared at the message, reading it twice to make sure I understood correctly. Even now, hours later, she was still framing my humiliation as a matter of comfort rather than exclusion. A buffet-style dinner. As if the problem had been logistics rather than deliberate dismissal. I typed and deleted half a dozen responses before settling on something neutral. Thanks for hosting. The food was lovely. Her reply came immediately. Mom said you seemed a little quiet today. Everything okay? A little quiet. As if my subdued demeanor had been a personality quirk rather than the natural response to being treated like an unwelcome intruder at my own family gathering. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost found myself questioning my own perceptions. Maybe I had been too sensitive. Maybe standing in the kitchen hadn't been that big a deal. But then I remembered Emma's confused face, Tyler's protective indignation, Michael's quiet fury as he'd abandoned his chair to stand beside me. I remembered Amanda's genuine horror at witnessing a family treat one of their own as disposable. The validation from outside eyes helped me trust my own instincts. "I'm fine," I texted back. "Just tired." Michael found me in the kitchen an hour later, sitting at our small round table with a cup of tea growing cold between my hands. He'd changed into comfortable clothes, and his hair was mussed from getting the children settled for the night. He looked tired but also determined, like someone who'd spent the evening processing difficult truths and coming to important conclusions. "We're not doing this anymore," he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from me. "We're not subjecting ourselves or our kids to that kind of treatment." I looked up at him, surprised by the firmness in his voice. Michael was naturally diplomatic, the kind of man who preferred harmony to conflict and usually worked hard to see all sides of a situation. But there was no ambivalence in his expression now, no attempt to find middle ground, or make excuses for behavior that had no acceptable justification. "It's my family," I said automatically. The old patterns of loyalty and obligation rising like a conditioned response. "They're difficult sometimes, but they're still family." "Are they?" Michael's question was gentle but pointed. "Because what I saw today didn't look like family to me. It looked like people who've convinced themselves that treating you badly is somehow acceptable because you've been willing to accept it." His words hit harder than I'd expected, partly because they echoed thoughts I'd been trying to suppress for years. How many family gatherings had I endured where I felt more like an outsider than a daughter? How many times had I made excuses for treatment that I would never tolerate from friends or colleagues? "What would you have me do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. It was the same answer I'd been avoiding for years, because it required more courage than I'd believed I possessed. "Stop going," Michael said simply. "Stop subjecting yourself to people who don't value you. Stop teaching our children that love looks like accepting cruelty for the sake of keeping the peace." The suggestion should have felt radical, but instead it settled over me like relief. How many years had I spent dreading family gatherings instead of anticipating them? How much emotional energy had I wasted trying to earn approval from people who seemed determined to withhold it? "They'll never forgive me if I stop coming to family events," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wondered why their forgiveness mattered when they'd never seemed particularly concerned with earning mine. "Maybe that says more about them than it does about you," Michael replied. "Real family doesn't require you to diminish yourself to maintain the relationship." I thought about Amanda's shocked face when she'd realized I was being made to eat standing up. Her assumption that I must be someone important had revealed just how far my own self-worth had eroded. Somewhere along the way, I'd internalized my family's assessment of my value, and forgotten that their treatment of me said nothing about who I actually was. My phone buzzed again. Another text from my mother this time. "Rebecca, I hope there are no hard feelings about today. Sometimes these gatherings are just challenging to coordinate. I'm sure you understand." I showed the message to Michael, who shook his head in disgust. "Look at that. She's not apologizing, she's asking you to understand. She's making you responsible for managing her guilt instead of taking responsibility for her actions." He was right. Of course. My mother was offering me the opportunity to absolve her of wrongdoing by framing my mistreatment as a logistical challenge rather than a deliberate choice. She wanted me to be understanding rather than hurt, accommodating rather than angry. For the first time in my adult life, I chose honesty over harmony. "I don't understand. Actually," I typed back. There was plenty of room at the table for another chair. Making me eat standing up was a choice, not a necessity. It was hurtful and unnecessary. I hit send before I could lose my nerve, my heart pounding as if I'd just jumped off a cliff. In 43 years of life, I'd never directly confronted my mother about her treatment of me. I'd swallowed countless small cruelties in the name of family peace, telling myself that being the bigger person meant absorbing whatever pain was necessary to maintain relationships. Her response came quickly, and I could practically hear the ice in her tone through the text message. "I'm very disappointed in your attitude, Rebecca. I worked hard to host a nice dinner for the family, and this is how you repay me. Perhaps you need to think about whether you're being fair." The familiar guilt tried to rise in my chest, the old programming that insisted my mother's feelings were more important than my own dignity. But sitting in my own kitchen, surrounded by the life Michael and I had built together, I found I could examine that guilt without being consumed by it. What exactly was I being unfair about? Expecting to be treated like an equal member of my own family, each a place at the table I'd helped prepare. Feeling hurt when I was excluded while a stranger was welcomed. "I think we need some space," I texted back, surprising myself with my own clarity. "I need time to process what happened today." Michael reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. That took courage. The phone buzzed once more. Space. What does that even mean? "You're being ridiculous, Rebecca. Call me tomorrow when you've calmed down." I turned the phone face down on the table and left it there. Tomorrow felt very far away, and when it came I wasn't sure I'd be ready to have that conversation. But for tonight, I was done being available for people who seemed to see my availability as a weakness rather than a gift. "What do we tell the kids?" I asked Michael. "They love their grandparents. We tell them the truth," he said. "That sometimes adults need to take breaks from relationships that aren't healthy. That loving someone doesn't mean accepting bad treatment. That they deserve to be around people who celebrate them rather than diminish them." Over the next few days the text messages continued. Jennifer sent updates about family plans, as if nothing had happened. My mother shared photos from her neighbor's Christmas decorations, maintaining the pretense of normalcy while ignoring the elephant in the room. Uncle Frank called to say he'd enjoyed seeing us, though his voice carried an undertone of discomfort that suggested he'd been bothered by what he'd witnessed. But it was a call from Amanda, Jennifer's catering friend, that surprised me most. She'd somehow gotten my number from Jennifer and called on Tuesday evening while I was helping Tyler with his homework. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out," she said after introducing herself. "I can't stop thinking about what happened on Thanksgiving. I've been in the catering business for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of family dynamics, but I've never seen anything quite like that." I felt my cheeks warm with embarrassment. Having a stranger witness my family's treatment of me had been almost as humiliating as the treatment itself. "I keep thinking about what you must have felt, standing there while everyone else sat down to eat," Amanda continued. "And I keep thinking about how normal everyone seemed to think it was. Like they'd done it before." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. The ease with which my family had relegated me to the kitchen suggested this wasn't the first time they'd found creative ways to communicate my lesser status. I thought about years of casual slights, forgotten birthdays, important news shared with everyone except me. It wasn't the first time, I admitted quietly. "I figured," Amanda said gently. "Listen, I know this isn't my business, but I wanted you to know that what I saw wasn't normal. I work with families all the time, and healthy families don't treat each other that way. Whatever you decide to do about it, trust your instincts. They were trying to make you feel small, and you deserve so much better than that." After we hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the family photos scattered across the mantel. Pictures of Tyler's first steps, Emma's kindergarten graduation, family vacations and birthday parties and quiet Sunday mornings. Life built on mutual respect and genuine affection. A life where no one had to earn their place at the table because everyone's presence was valued from the start. This was what family could look like when it was built on love rather than hierarchy, choice rather than obligation, celebration rather than competition. Looking at these pictures, I couldn't imagine treating any member of this family the way I'd been treated on Thanksgiving. The contrast was so stark, it made my chest ache. Michael found me there an hour later, tears drying on my cheeks as I processed the full weight of what I'd been accepting for so many years. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, settling beside me on the couch. "About how different it could have been," I said. "About how many years I spent trying to earn something that should have been freely given." And now, I looked around our living room, warm and lived in, and full of evidence of the life we'd created together. A life where love wasn't conditional on performance, where belonging wasn't something you had to constantly prove you deserved. "Now I think I want to focus on the family that actually wants me," I said. "The one that sees me standing and immediately chooses to stand with me." Michael smiled and pulled me closer. "That sounds like the best plan I've heard all year." Outside, the November wind rattled the windows and scattered the last of the autumn leaves across our front yard. But inside our house, surrounded by the family I'd chosen and built, I felt warmer than I had in years. It had taken a stranger's horrified reaction to help me see clearly what I'd been accepting as normal. But now that I could see it, I knew there was no going back to the shadows. I was done eating standing up, while others claimed their seats at tables that should have welcomed me. It was time to build my own table, one where everyone who sat down was celebrated rather than merely tolerated. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with an unusual sense of clarity. The house was still quiet, Michael breathing softly beside me, the children deep in the dreamless sleep of childhood. I slipped out of bed and padded downstairs to the kitchen, where I made coffee and sat at our small round table watching the sky lighten through the window. For the first time in years, I felt truly awake. It was as if I'd been living in a haze of lowered expectations and normalized mistreatment, so gradually diminished that I hadn't noticed how small I'd become. But Amanda's shocked reaction and Michael's quiet fury had jolted me back to full consciousness, reminding me that what I'd learned to accept wasn't acceptable at all. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the messages that had accumulated over the past few days. My mother's attempts to minimize what had happened. Jennifer's casual dismissal of my feelings. The family group chat discussing Christmas plans as if Thanksgiving had been a rousing success. But buried among them was a text from Aunt Carol that I'd almost missed. "I should have spoken up on Thursday. What happened wasn't right, and I'm sorry I didn't say anything at the time. You handled it with more grace than it deserved." The message brought tears to my eyes, not because it changed anything, but because it confirmed that I hadn't imagined the cruelty. Someone else had seen it, recognized it for what it was, and felt compelled to acknowledge it. The validation was like water in a desert I hadn't realized I'd been crossing. I thought about the years I'd spent doubting my own perceptions, wondering if I was too sensitive, too demanding, too difficult. How many times had I accepted explanations that required me to ignore my own eyes and trust other people's versions of reality instead? But I was done with that now, done with accepting crumbs and calling them feasts, done with making myself smaller to fit into spaces that were never designed to accommodate me, done with teaching my children that love looked like enduring whatever treatment was offered. As the morning light strengthened, I began making plans. Real plans for a real future, one built on my own terms rather than other people's limitations. 2 weeks passed before my mother called. I was in my home office, working on fabric swatches for a client's master bedroom renovation, when her name appeared on my phone screen. The afternoon light was streaming through my workspace windows, illuminating the color samples I'd arranged across my drafting table in careful gradations from deep forest green to warm cream. I stared at the phone for 3 rings before answering, my stomach tightening with the familiar cocktail of apprehension and hope that had defined my relationship with my mother for as long as I could remember. Rebecca, her voice was crisp, businesslike, carrying none of the warmth she typically reserved for phone calls with her daughters. "I think we need to discuss your recent behavior, not how I was doing, not whether I'd had time to process our last conversation. My behavior, as if I were a misbehaving child who needed correction rather than an adult woman who had simply refused to accept unacceptable treatment." "What specifically would you like to discuss?" I asked, setting down the fabric sample I'd been holding and preparing myself for whatever version of reality she was about to present. This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand, she continued, her tone suggesting that the situation was somehow of my making rather than her response to it. Jennifer tells me you haven't responded to any of the family group texts about Christmas planning. Your father and I are very concerned about this attitude you've developed. The word attitude hung in the air like an accusation. In my mother's vocabulary, having an attitude meant refusing to accept whatever treatment was offered without complaint. It meant having boundaries. It meant valuing your own dignity over other people's comfort. I've been taking some time to think, I said carefully, choosing my words with the same precision I used when selecting colors for a difficult client. Thanksgiving was difficult for me. Difficult, her voice sharpened with incredulity. Rebecca, you're 43 years old. Surely you can handle minor inconveniences without creating family drama. Minor inconveniences. That's what she was calling it. Being excluded from my own family's dinner table while a stranger was welcomed with open arms was a minor inconvenience. The humiliation my children had witnessed was family drama of my own creation. Mom, I said slowly, feeling my way through words I'd never dared speak before, making me eat standing up while everyone else sat at the table wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was deliberately exclusionary and hurtful. Oh, for heaven's sake, she snapped, her composure finally cracking. You're acting like we locked you in a closet. You ate the same food as everyone else, you were part of the conversation. So what if you had to stand for an hour? People stand at cocktail parties all the time. The comparison was so breathtakingly tone-deaf that I almost laughed. Choosing to stand at a cocktail party while mingling with other guests was entirely different from being forced to eat alone in a kitchen while your family enjoyed a seated meal in the next room. But explaining that distinction would require her to acknowledge the deliberate nature of my exclusion, and she seemed determined to reframe the entire incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a calculated slight. It wasn't about the standing, Mom. It was about what the standing represented. About being treated as less important than everyone else at my own family gathering. Less important. Her voice rose with what sounded like genuine outrage. You think you're more important than everyone else. You think the entire dinner should have been rearranged to accommodate your preferences. The accusation was so perfectly backwards that it took my breath away. She'd managed to twist my desire for equal treatment into evidence of narcissistic entitlement. In her version of events, wanting a seat at the table was demanding special treatment rather than basic respect. I think I deserved the same consideration as everyone else, I said quietly, including Amanda, who was essentially a stranger but was offered a chair at the table while I was sent to the kitchen. Amanda was helping with the meal preparation, she was working. Of course we offered her a seat. And what was I doing, Mom? I helped cook that food too. I brought dishes from home. I showed up early to help with preparations. But somehow my contributions didn't earn me the same courtesy you extended to Jennifer's friend. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. We both knew that my contributions had been just as significant as Amanda's, if not more so. We both knew that there had been plenty of room for another chair at that table. We both knew that my standing had been a choice, not a necessity. I don't like this person you've become, Rebecca, my mother said finally, her voice cold with disapproval. This angry, confrontational version of yourself, it's not attractive. The criticism landed exactly where it was intended to, striking at the deep well of insecurity I'd carried since childhood. The fear that I was too much, too difficult, too demanding. The terror that if I stopped being accommodating, if I stopped accepting whatever scraps of affection were offered, I would lose even those meager portions of love. But something had shifted in me since Thanksgiving. Amanda's horrified reaction had shown me how my situation looked to outside eyes. Michael's quiet fury had reminded me that people who truly loved me wouldn't ask me to diminish myself for their comfort. My children's confusion had highlighted the lessons I was teaching them about what love looked like. I'm not angry, Mom, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I'm just not willing to pretend anymore that being treated poorly is acceptable. Treated poorly, she was building toward one of her righteous indignations, the kind that had always made me backpedal and apologize in the past. Do you have any idea how hard I worked to put together that dinner? How much effort it took to coordinate everything? And this is the thanks I get. Drama and accusations and attitude. I never asked you to coordinate anything for me, I said, the words coming from some deeper place of truth I'd never accessed before. I would have been happy to host Thanksgiving myself. I offered to bring additional dishes, I showed up early to help. None of that was required or expected. But basic courtesy toward your own daughter should have been a given. Basic courtesy. Her voice was shrill now, all pretense of calm maternal concern abandoned. You think you deserve special treatment because you're my daughter? You think family relationships exempt you from normal social expectations? What normal social expectations, Mom? The expectation that I should be grateful for any inclusion at all. The expectation that I should accept whatever treatment is offered without complaint. Because those aren't normal expectations. Those are the expectations of someone who sees me as a burden rather than a blessing. I could hear her breathing hard on the other end of the line, processing words she'd never heard from me before. For 43 years, I'd been the accommodating daughter, the one who smoothed over conflicts and absorbed hurts and made everyone else's comfort a priority over my own well-being. This version of me, the one who named problems instead of ignoring them, was unfamiliar territory for both of us. If that's how you feel, she said finally, her voice arctic with wounded pride, then perhaps you need to consider whether this family is a good fit for your new expectations. The threat was clear: conform or be cast out, accept whatever treatment was offered or lose access to family entirely. It was the nuclear option, the final card in her deck, the ultimate test of my commitment to keeping the peace at any cost. A year ago, even a month ago, that threat would have sent me scrambling to apologize, to minimize my own feelings, to beg for forgiveness for the crime of expecting better treatment. I would have convinced myself that some family was better than no family, that love with conditions was still love, that I was being ungrateful for questioning the scraps of affection I was offered. But sitting in my home office, surrounded by the evidence of the life I'd built with Michael and our children, I found I wasn't afraid of her threat anymore. What was she actually threatening to take away? The privilege of being excluded from family gatherings. The opportunity to absorb criticism and casual cruelty. The honor of teaching my children that love looked like accepting whatever treatment was offered. Maybe you're right, I said quietly. Maybe this family isn't a good fit for someone who expects to be treated with basic respect and dignity. The silence that followed was so complete, I thought the call might have dropped. But then I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone who'd expected capitulation and received defiance instead. Fine, she said finally, her voice tight with rage and disbelief. If that's your choice, then live with the consequences. Don't come crying to me when you realize what you've thrown away. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in the sudden quiet of my office, phone still pressed to my ear, heart pounding with the adrenaline of having finally spoken truths I'd carried silently for decades. I set the phone down carefully and looked around my workspace, at the beautiful fabrics spread across my table, at the before and after photos of rooms I'd transformed from cold and formal to warm and welcoming. This was my life's work, helping people create spaces where they felt valued and comfortable and at peace. It seemed fitting that I was finally learning to create that same sense of belonging for myself. That evening, Michael found me in the kitchen making dinner, moving through the familiar motions of chopping vegetables and seasoning chicken with unusual concentration. Tyler and Emma were in the living room, working on a puzzle together, their voices a comfortable backdrop of sibling negotiation and shared accomplishment. "How did the call go?" he asked gently, though my expression had probably already given him the answer. I told him about the conversation, about my mother's attempts to reframe my exclusion as minor inconvenience, about her final ultimatum, and my unexpected calm in the face of it. He listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. She actually said the family might not be a good fit for you, he asked when I finished, his voice tight with controlled anger. She did, and you know what? She might be right. Maybe I've outgrown a family that requires me to shrink myself to fit into their expectations. Michael wrapped his arms around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder, as we both looked out the kitchen window at our backyard, where the late autumn light was painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The kids are going to ask questions, he said quietly. I know, and I'm going to tell them the truth. That sometimes adults need to step away from relationships that aren't healthy, that loving someone doesn't mean accepting bad treatment, that they deserve to be around people who celebrate them, rather than merely tolerate them. What about Christmas? I considered the question, imagining the holidays without the familiar stress of managing my mother's expectations and Jennifer's casual cruelties. Without the exhausting work of pretending everything was fine while absorbing slights and swallowing hurt. Without teaching my children that family love looked like enduring whatever treatment was offered. We'll create our own traditions, I said, better ones. Over the next few days, word of my conversation with my mother spread through the family network with the efficiency of a carefully tended gossip vine. Jennifer called to express her shock and disappointment at my selfishness. Uncle Frank left a voicemail, suggesting I might want to apologize before the situation got worse. Even some family friends reached out to encourage me to make peace for the sake of the children. But for every call urging reconciliation, I received another offering support. Aunt Carol called to say she'd been bothered by what she'd witnessed at Thanksgiving and was proud of me for standing up for myself. My cousin Lisa, Uncle Frank's daughter, sent a long text message sharing her own experiences with family exclusion and expressing relief that someone had finally named the pattern. Most surprisingly, I received a handwritten note from my father, delivered to my office by mail rather than shared directly. His handwriting was careful and measured, his words chosen with the precision of someone unaccustomed to emotional expression. Rebecca, the note read, your mother and I have different perspectives on what happened at Thanksgiving. I want you to know that I noticed the seating situation and found it troubling. I should have spoken up at the time, and I regret that I didn't. I hope we can find a way forward that doesn't require you to accept treatment that makes you uncomfortable. You deserve better from all of us. The note brought tears to my eyes, not because it changed the fundamental dynamic, but because it confirmed what I'd always suspected. My father had witnessed my exclusion and recognized it as wrong, but hadn't felt empowered to challenge my mother's social orchestrations. The acknowledgement felt like a small gift, validation that my perceptions had been accurate even when everyone else was insisting they weren't. But the real test came when Tyler, my 8-year-old, asked the question I'd been dreading during our drive to school one morning. Mom, are we going to Grandma's house for Christmas? I'd been preparing for this conversation for days, but sitting there in the school pickup line, with my son's earnest face reflected in the rearview mirror, all my careful explanations seemed inadequate. Probably not this year, sweetie, I said gently. Grandma and I are having some disagreements about how to treat each other nicely, because she made you eat standing up. The simple clarity of his observation took my breath away. Children saw truth with such uncomplicated directness, unencumbered by the complex justifications adults use to normalize unacceptable behavior. That's part of it, yes. What did you think about that? Tyler was quiet for a moment, considering his words with the seriousness he brought to all important topics. I thought it was mean, he said finally, and I thought you looked sad. I was sad, I admitted, and you're right that it was mean. Sometimes adults don't treat each other very nicely, even in families. So we're not going to see them anymore. The hope in his voice was unmistakable, and it broke my heart to realize that my children had been absorbing the same stress and discomfort I'd been feeling at family gatherings. They'd been watching me diminish myself for the sake of keeping peace, learning lessons about love and family that I desperately didn't want them to carry forward. We might see them again someday, I said carefully, but only if they can learn to treat all of us with kindness and respect. And if they can't do that, then we'll just love them from far away while we spend time with people who make us feel good about ourselves. Like Dad's family, and like our friends, and like each other. Tyler nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. Can we have Christmas here this year? With the big tree in the living room? We absolutely can, I said, surprised by how much joy the prospect brought me. We can make it exactly the way we want it to be. That afternoon, I called Amanda, Jennifer's catering friend, whose shocked reaction at Thanksgiving had been the catalyst for my awakening. I'd been thinking about her words, about her 15 years of experience with family dynamics, about her immediate recognition that what she'd witnessed wasn't normal. I wanted to thank you, I told her when she answered, for speaking up at Thanksgiving, for helping me see the situation clearly. Oh honey, she said warmly, I've been thinking about you ever since that day. How are you doing? Better, I said, and meant it. I've been making some changes. Good for you. You know, in my line of work, I see a lot of families, and I can usually tell within the first hour whether people genuinely enjoy each other's company or whether they're just going through the motions. Your family that day, they seemed like they were tolerating you rather than celebrating you. That's exactly how it felt, I said, grateful for her outside perspective. Well, for what it's worth, you seemed like someone worth celebrating to me, and that husband of yours, the way he stood up from the table to be with you. That's what real love looks like. After we hung up, I sat in my office, thinking about celebration versus toleration, about the difference between being welcomed and being endured. I thought about the life Michael and I had built together, the friends who sought out our company, the clients who trusted me with their most personal spaces, the children who ran to me with their joys and sorrows. I was surrounded by people who celebrated my presence, rather than merely tolerating it. People who saw my worth without requiring me to prove it. People who loved me not despite my needs and boundaries, but because of the whole person I was, when those needs and boundaries were respected. It had taken a stranger's horrified reaction, and my own children's confused questions, to help me see what I'd been accepting as normal. But now that I could see clearly, the path forward felt obvious. I was done eating standing up, while others claimed their seats at tables that should have welcomed me. I was done teaching my children that love looked like accepting whatever treatment was offered. I was done shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never designed to accommodate my full presence. It was time to build something better, something that started with the radical idea that I deserved the same consideration I so freely gave to others. Something that honored the love I'd found, rather than chasing the approval I'd never quite earned. The house felt different that evening, as we moved through our usual routines. Tyler and Emma seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight they hadn't even realized they were carrying had been lifted from their small shoulders. Michael hummed, while making dinner, a contentment in his movements that spoke of battles fought and won, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace, not the fragile peace that came from avoiding conflict, but the solid peace that came from living authentically, from choosing love over obligation, celebration over toleration, truth over comfortable lies. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, covering our yard in a blanket of pristine white. Inside our warm house, surrounded by people who valued my presence, I finally understood what home was supposed to feel like. It felt like belonging without having to earn it. Like love without conditions, like a table where everyone had a seat, and no one had to stand alone in the kitchen, hoping for scraps of affection from people who'd never learned to see their worth. December arrived, with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The Connecticut landscape transformed into a winter wonderland outside my office windows, and for the first time since I could remember, I felt no dread at the approaching holiday season, no anxiety about managing family dynamics or walking on eggshells around fragile egos, no exhausting mental preparation for inevitable slights disguised as tradition. Instead, I felt anticipation, real genuine excitement about creating Christmas exactly the way my immediate family wanted it to be. Michael found me in the living room one Saturday morning, measuring the corner where we'd decided to put our tree. The room was filled with soft December light, and I was already envisioning garland draped along the mantel, stockings hung with care, presents wrapped in paper the children had chosen themselves. How big are we thinking? He asked, settling on the couch with his coffee and watching me with the gentle amusement he reserved for my more ambitious projects. Big, I said decisively, the biggest tree that will fit in this room. Tyler wants to be able to lie under it and look up at the lights, and Emma wants enough space underneath for all the presents she's planning to make for everyone. Sounds perfect, he said, and I could hear the happiness in his voice, the relief. We'd all been carrying the stress of difficult family gatherings for so long that we'd forgotten what holidays could feel like when they were built around joy instead of obligation. My phone rang from the kitchen counter, interrupting the peaceful morning planning. Jennifer's name flashed across the screen, and I felt my stomach tighten with the familiar anxiety that had become my conditioned response to family contact. Want me to get it? Michael asked, recognizing my hesitation. I shook my head and walked to the kitchen, steeling myself for whatever version of reality Jennifer was prepared to present today. 3 weeks had passed since my conversation with my mother, and the family silence had been both painful and healing. No group texts about Christmas plans, no casual invitations to holiday shopping trips, no pretense that everything was normal while fundamental issues remained unaddressed. Hi Jen, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Rebecca, thank goodness, she began without preamble, her voice carrying the breathless urgency she typically reserved for genuine crises. I need to talk to you about Mom. My first instinct was the old familiar surge of panic. Was she sick, hurt, in need of something only I could provide? The programming of 43 years kicked in immediately, ready to drop everything and rush to solve whatever problem had emerged. What's wrong? I asked, already mentally calculating drive times and rearranging my day. She's planning to cancel Christmas, Jennifer said dramatically. She says, if the family is falling apart anyway, there's no point in pretending to celebrate together. Dad's beside himself. She won't even let him put up the outdoor lights. I absorbed this information slowly, trying to separate my automatic guilt response from actual rational analysis. My mother was canceling Christmas because I'd refused to accept unacceptable treatment. She was punishing the entire family for my boundary setting, using their disappointment as leverage to bring me back into line. It was emotional manipulation at its finest, designed to make me feel responsible for everyone else's unhappiness, while avoiding any accountability for the behavior that had created the situation in the first place. That's unfortunate, I said carefully, surprised by my own calm. I'm sorry to hear she's struggling with the changes. Struggling? Jennifer's voice rose with incredulity. Rebecca, she's devastated. We all are. This whole thing has gotten completely out of hand over something so minor. There it was again, minor. The family's collective insistence that my humiliation had been insignificant, that my response was disproportionate, that my pain was an overreaction to circumstances that barely qualified as problematic. Standing alone in the kitchen, while everyone else enjoyed dinner, wasn't minor to me, I said quietly, and neither was the way everyone acted like it was perfectly normal and acceptable. But you're willing to
destroy Christmas over it? Jennifer's voice carried a note of genuine bewilderment, as if my refusal to pretend everything was fine constituted some form of incomprehensible selfishness. I'm not destroying anything, Jen. I'm just not pretending anymore that being treated poorly is acceptable. If Mom wants to cancel Christmas because I won't apologize for expecting basic respect, that's her choice. Basic respect. Jennifer's voice sharpened with frustration. You got the same food as everyone else. You were part of all the conversations. So what if you had to stand for a while? People do that at parties all the time. The cocktail party comparison again. As if there was no difference between choosing to mingle while standing and being forced to eat alone because you weren't deemed worthy of a seat. The willful blindness was almost impressive in its thoroughness. If it was so insignificant, I said, then why didn't anyone offer to get another chair? Why didn't anyone suggest that someone else stand for a while? Why was I the only person whose comfort was considered expendable? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Jennifer had no answer because there was no acceptable answer.
The truth was that my comfort had been expendable because I'd trained them to see it that way through years of accepting whatever treatment was offered without complaint. "Look," Jennifer said finally, her voice taking on the tone of forced reasonableness she used when trying to close a difficult real estate deal. "Mom made a mistake. She's too proud to admit it directly, but she knows she handled things badly. Can't you just call her and smooth things over? For the sake of the family?" "Smooth things over how?" I asked. "By pretending it didn't happen? By apologizing for being hurt? By promising to accept whatever treatment she offers in the future without complaint? By being the bigger person," Jennifer said, as if the phrase settled everything. "You've always been good at that, the bigger person. Code for the person who absorbed hurt without complaint, who prioritized everyone else's comfort over their own well-being, who took responsibility for managing other people's guilt and shame instead of requiring them to face the consequences of their choices. I'd been the bigger person for 43 years. I'd swallowed countless small cruelties, ignored deliberate slights, and made excuses for behavior that would have ended friendships if I'd tolerated it from anyone outside my family. And what had being the bigger person gotten me? A family that felt entitled to treat me as less than equal because they knew I'd never hold them accountable. "I'm done being the bigger person, Jen," I said quietly. "It's time for other people to take responsibility for their own behavior and the consequences that follow." "So you're really going to let Mom cancel Christmas? You're going to let the whole family suffer because your feelings got hurt?" The accusation landed exactly where it was intended, striking at the deep well of guilt I'd carried since childhood. The fear that my needs were too much, that my boundaries were selfish, that wanting better treatment made me demanding and difficult. But sitting in my warm kitchen, looking out at the yard where Tyler and Emma would soon build snowmen and have snowball fights, I realized that guilt had lost its power over me. My children deserved to see their mother treated with respect. They deserved to learn that love didn't require accepting cruelty. They deserved holidays built on joy rather than obligation. "The family is suffering because Mom chose to exclude me rather than get another chair," I said. "Because she chose pride over relationship. Because she's choosing manipulation over accountability even now. I didn't create this situation, and I'm not responsible for fixing it." "Fine," Jennifer said, her voice tight with anger and frustration. "But don't expect any of us to come crawling back when you realize what you've lost." After she hung up, I stood in my kitchen processing the conversation and its implications. My family was prepared to cancel Christmas entirely rather than acknowledge that they'd treated me poorly. They were willing to punish themselves and each other rather than offer a simple apology or admission of wrongdoing. The revelation should have been devastating, but instead it felt clarifying. This wasn't a family struggling to work through a difficult situation. This was a family so invested in maintaining a particular hierarchy that they'd rather have no relationship at all than an equal one. Michael appeared in the doorway, his expression concerned. "Everything okay?" I told him about the conversation, about my mother's threat to cancel Christmas, about Jennifer's attempts to make me responsible for fixing a situation I hadn't created. He listened quietly, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. "So they'd rather have no Christmas than have one where you're treated with basic respect," he said when I finished. Apparently, he shook his head slowly. "That tells you everything you need to know about their priorities." That evening we had a family meeting. Tyler and Emma sat on the couch between Michael and me, their faces serious as they sensed the importance of whatever we were about to discuss. I'd been dreading this conversation for weeks, worried about disappointing them, concerned about the impact of family fractures on their young hearts. "We need to talk about Christmas," I began gently. "About some changes that are happening with Grandma and Grandpa. Are we still not going to their house?" Emma asked, her voice small but not particularly sad. The lack of distress in her question surprised me. "No, sweetheart, we're not. And they've decided not to have Christmas at all this year." Tyler frowned. "Because of what happened at Thanksgiving, because they were mean to you?" The directness of his question took my breath away. Children saw through adult complications to essential truths with stunning clarity. Partially, yes. Sometimes adults have disagreements about how to treat each other, and sometimes those disagreements are too big to work through right away. So we're having Christmas here? Emma asked, her voice brightening considerably. We are. Just the four of us, plus anyone else we want to invite. We can make it exactly how we want it to be. Can we have pancakes for Christmas breakfast? Tyler asked eagerly. And hot chocolate with marshmallows, Emma added. And can we open presents in our pajamas? Tyler continued. Their enthusiasm was infectious, their excitement about creating our own traditions overwhelming any disappointment about missing the formal gatherings they'd grown to associate with stress and careful behavior. We can do all of those things, I said, pulling them both closer. We can make Christmas exactly what we want it to be. Over the next 2 weeks, we threw ourselves into holiday preparations with an energy I hadn't felt in years. We spent a Saturday afternoon at the tree farm, searching for the perfect Fraser fir while Tyler and Emma debated the merits of various candidates. We came home with a 8-foot beauty that filled our living room with the scent of winter and possibility. We made gingerbread houses that collapsed spectacularly and sugar cookies that disappeared almost as quickly as we decorated them. We watched Christmas movies while stringing popcorn for the tree, laughing at Emma's running commentary and Tyler's detailed questions about plot logistics. We volunteered at the local food bank, helping to sort donations and pack holiday meals for families in need. The children threw themselves into the work with enthusiasm, carefully arranging canned goods and adding hand-drawn pictures to gift bags. It felt good to focus on giving rather than navigating family politics. Most surprisingly, we weren't alone. Aunt Carol called to ask if she and Uncle Frank could join us for Christmas dinner, explaining that they'd decided to skip the family gathering in solidarity with our position. Lisa, my cousin, asked if she could bring her children for Christmas Eve dessert and carols. Even my father called, his voice uncertain but determined. I know things are complicated right now, he said carefully, but I wondered if I might be able to see the grandchildren during the holidays. Maybe take them for lunch one afternoon? Of course, Dad, I said, surprised by the warmth in my own voice. You're always welcome here, you all are, as long as you can treat everyone with kindness and respect. The week before Christmas, Amanda called unexpectedly. I hope you don't mind, she said, but I heard through Jennifer that your family was having some difficulties over the holidays. I wanted you to know that my offer stands if you ever want to talk to someone who's been in the catering business long enough to recognize unhealthy family dynamics. Actually, I said, we're doing really well. We're having Christmas here this year, creating our own traditions. Good for you, she said warmly. You know, I've been thinking about what happened at Thanksgiving, and I keep coming back to something. That wasn't the first time they'd done something like that to you, was it? The question was gentle but direct, and it deserved an honest answer. No, I admitted. It wasn't. I figured, the way everyone acted like it was normal, like they'd done it before. I work with a lot of families, and I can usually tell the difference between people who genuinely care about each other and people who are just going through the motions. Your husband's reaction, though, standing up from that table to be with you? That's what real love looks like. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about her words. About the difference between people who genuinely care and people who go through the motions. About what real love looks like when it's not conditional on compliance or performance. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle snowfall that turned our neighborhood into a winter wonderland. The house was warm and bright, filled with the scents of cinnamon and pine, and the sounds of children's laughter. Aunt Carol and Uncle Frank arrived early with armloads of presents and genuine smiles. Lisa came with her kids, and the house filled with the joyful chaos of cousins playing together without the undercurrent of adult tension that had marked so many family gatherings. My father appeared at the door just as we were serving dinner, looking uncertain but hopeful.
He hugged Tyler and Emma with obvious joy, his face lighting up at their excited chatter about Santa and presents and snow angels. "This is lovely," he said quietly, looking around at our dinner table where everyone had a seat and no one was relegated to standing in corners. "Really lovely." We ate and laughed and told stories, the conversation flowing naturally without anyone having to manage dynamics or navigate sensitivities. The children performed an impromptu Christmas pageant using dish towels as costumes and the sofa cushions as a stage. Uncle Frank played Christmas carols on our old piano, while the rest of us sang along, our voices blending in imperfect harmony. Later, after everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, Michael and I sat in our living room looking at our Christmas tree. The lights twinkled softly in the darkness, casting gentle shadows on walls decorated with our children's artwork and family photos. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the family gathering that was happening without us, about the mother who'd chosen pride over relationship, about the sister who'd chosen comfort over truth. "None," I said, and meant it completely. "This was the best Christmas we've ever had. Even without your mom and Jennifer, especially without them," I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. For the first time in years, I got to enjoy Christmas instead of just enduring it. The kids got to be themselves instead of walking on eggshells. You got to relax instead of watching me navigate family landmines. Michael nodded, pulling me closer on the couch. "They don't know what they're missing." "Maybe not, but we do." 2 days after Christmas, I received a text from Jennifer. Not an apology or an acknowledgement of the choices that had led to our separation, but a photo of the elaborate Christmas display at my mother's country club, where she'd apparently decided to have dinner instead of cooking at home. "Thought you might like to see what you missed," the message read. I looked at the photo of the formal dining room with its pristine white tablecloths and elaborate floral arrangements, trying to imagine myself there instead of in my own warm living room surrounded by people who celebrated my presence rather than merely tolerated it. "Looks lovely," I texted back. "Hope you had a nice time." Her response came quickly. "Better than last year. No drama, no drama." Code for no one asking to be treated with basic respect, no one pointing out uncomfortable truths, no one disrupting the comfortable fiction that their treatment of me had been acceptable. "Glad to hear it," I replied, and then I deleted the conversation thread. Winter settled into its rhythm, and life moved forward with a peace I hadn't experienced in years. The children thrived without the stress of managing difficult family dynamics. Michael and I rediscovered the joy of holidays built around love rather than obligation. I threw myself into my work with renewed energy, helping clients create spaces where they felt valued and comfortable. In February, my mother called. "Rebecca," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I think enough time has passed. Perhaps we should discuss moving forward, not acknowledging what had happened. Not apologizing for the choices that had created the separation, just moving forward as if nothing had occurred." "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "Well, Easter is coming up. I thought perhaps you could come for dinner. We could put all this unpleasantness behind us." Put it behind us. As if my exclusion from Thanksgiving had been a minor social faux pas, rather than a deliberate exclusion. As if the months of silence and manipulation had been mutual mistakes rather than conscious choices. "I appreciate the invitation," I said carefully, "but I'm not interested in putting anything behind us without first addressing what happened." "Addressing it how?" Her voice sharpened with familiar impatience, with an acknowledgement that making me eat standing up while everyone else sat at the table was wrong. "With an apology for the months of manipulation that followed. With a genuine commitment to treating me as an equal member of the family going forward." The silence that followed was long and telling. "I see," she said finally, "so you're determined to hold on to this grievance indefinitely." "I'm determined to maintain boundaries that protect my well-being and my children's understanding of what healthy relationships look like, and if I'm not willing to provide the apology you're demanding, Then we'll continue loving you from a distance while building a life surrounded by people who treat us with respect and kindness. Another long pause. I'm disappointed in you, Rebecca. I raised you to be more forgiving than this. You raised me to be accommodating, I corrected gently. To accept whatever treatment was offered without complaint. But forgiveness doesn't require me to accept ongoing mistreatment, it doesn't require me to pretend that wrong behavior was acceptable. Fine, she said, her voice cold with finality, if that's your choice then live with it. For the second time in 3 months, she hung up on me, but this time, I felt no anxiety about the disconnection, no guilt about the choice I'd made, no fear about the consequences of maintaining my boundaries. I felt free. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility. Tyler and Emma helped me plant a vegetable garden in our backyard, their excitement about growing their own tomatoes and strawberries infectious. We hosted barbecues for friends and neighbors, our house becoming a gathering place for people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. In May, I received an invitation to Jennifer's birthday party, a formal card with elegant script, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than her sister. No personal note, no acknowledgement of the months that had passed, or the issues that remained unresolved. I sent back a polite decline with a generic birthday wish, but it was a call from Aunt Carol in June that really surprised me. I wanted to let you know, she said carefully, that your mother has been telling people you've cut the family off because of some imagined slight. She's painting herself as the victim of your unreasonable behavior. I wasn't surprised by the information, but I was grateful for Carol's honesty in sharing it. What are people saying? I asked. The people who know you both are asking questions, Carol admitted. They remember how she used to treat you and they're wondering if there's more to the story than she's sharing. And what do you tell them? The truth, that you were excluded from your own family's Thanksgiving dinner and refused to pretend it was acceptable. That you've offered reconciliation contingent on basic respect, and she's chosen pride over relationship. The validation felt like a gift, confirmation that my perceptions had been accurate and my boundaries reasonable. Thank you, I said, for seeing the truth and being willing to speak it. You're my niece, she said simply. I love you, and I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. As summer turned to fall, I found myself preparing for our second Thanksgiving as a nuclear family with genuine excitement rather than dread. Tyler and Emma helped plan the menu, their requests simple and heartfelt. Michael's parents would be joining us, along with Aunt Carol and Uncle Frank, and a few close friends whose company we genuinely enjoyed. The contrast with the previous year was striking. Instead of anxiety about managing family dynamics, I felt anticipation about creating new memories. Instead of walking on eggshells, I could focus on cooking food we actually wanted to eat and creating an atmosphere of genuine warmth and welcome. The night before Thanksgiving, I stood in my kitchen preparing dishes for the next day's feast, my house filling with the sense of herbs and butter and possibility. Through the window, I could see Michael and Tyler raking leaves in the backyard, while Emma supervised from her perch on the swing set. This was family, not perfect, not without challenges, but built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Built on the revolutionary idea that everyone deserved a seat at the table, that everyone's comfort mattered equally, that love looked like celebration rather than mere toleration. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, I realized it was from Amanda, Jennifer's former catering friend. Thinking of you as the holidays approach, it read, I hope you're surrounded by people who celebrate you the way you deserve to be celebrated. The message brought tears to my eyes, not from sadness but from gratitude. A stranger had seen my worth when my own family couldn't. She'd recognized the wrongness of my treatment when the people who claimed to love me had insisted it was acceptable. I typed back quickly. Thank you. This year I am. Thanksgiving Day dawned bright and crisp, the kind of autumn day that made Connecticut look like a postcard. The house filled gradually with people who genuinely wanted to be there, who brought laughter and stories and genuine appreciation for the effort that had gone into creating the gathering. We ate at a table where everyone had a seat, we laughed without worrying about offending anyone. We shared what we were grateful for without the undercurrent of obligation that had marked so many family gatherings. Tyler talked about his soccer team. Emma shared her excitement about her upcoming school play. Michael's father told stories about his own childhood Thanksgivings that had everyone laughing until our sides hurt. When Aunt Carol raised her glass for a toast, her words were simple but profound. To chosen family, she said, looking around our table with obvious affection. To people who love us not because they have to, but because they want to. To Rebecca for teaching us all what it means to choose love over obligation. As glasses clinked around our table, I felt a sense of completion I'd never experienced before. Not the hollow satisfaction of duty fulfilled, but the deep contentment of authentic connection. This was what family could be when it was built on mutual respect rather than hierarchy, choice rather than obligation, celebration rather than mere toleration. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, and the children were asleep, Michael and I sat on our back porch wrapped in blankets, looking up at stars that seemed unusually bright in the clear November sky. "Any second thoughts?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew the answer. I thought about the question seriously, considering the family gathering that had happened without us, the relationships that remained fractured, the bridges that might never be rebuilt. "None," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. This is what I want our children to remember about family. This sense of belonging without having to earn it. This feeling of being celebrated rather than tolerated. "They'll never understand what they lost," Michael said quietly. "Maybe not," I agreed, "but we understand what we found." Above us, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, constant and beautiful and free. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged among them. Not because I'd earned my place through performance or compliance, but simply because I existed, because I had value, because I deserved to take up space in this vast and beautiful universe. I was no longer the woman who ate standing up while others claimed their seats at tables that should have welcomed her. I was no longer the daughter who accepted crumbs and called them feasts. I was no longer the mother who taught her children that love looked like enduring whatever treatment was offered. I was Rebecca Thompson, interior designer, wife, mother, friend. I was someone who created beautiful spaces where people felt valued and welcome. I was someone who chose love over obligation, truth over comfortable lies, celebration over mere toleration, and for the first time in 43 years, that was enough, more than enough, it was everything. 3 years later, I was standing in my newly expanded office space, reviewing color palettes for a client's Victorian restoration, when the call came that changed everything. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows I'd had installed when I'd taken over the adjacent suite, painting my work samples in natural light that made every shade of blue and green seem alive with possibility. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but something about the area code made me pause. It was local, probably another potential client referral from the interior design magazine feature that had run last month. My business had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible when I'd first started working from my kitchen table 8 years ago. "Thompson Design Studio, this is Rebecca, Rebecca Thompson." The voice was uncertain, older with a tremor I couldn't quite place. "This is Margaret Chen, from Millbrook General Hospital. I have your father Robert Collins, here in the emergency department." The words hit me like cold water, instantly washing away the peaceful contentment of my morning routine. My father, emergency department. The fabric samples in my hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. What happened? I managed, already reaching for my car keys with my free hand. "He collapsed at the grocery store about an hour ago. Heart attack, we believe, but he's stable now. He's been asking for you specifically. He gave us your number and said to call you first, before anyone else in the family. Before anyone else in the family." The phrase carried weight I wasn't prepared to examine just yet. My father, lying in a hospital bed, had chosen to reach out to the daughter who'd been estranged from the family for 3 years, rather than the one who still showed up for every gathering. "I'll be right there," I said, gathering my purse and locking the office door behind me with shaking hands. The drive to the hospital took 15 minutes that felt like hours. My mind raced through memories I'd carefully packed away, moments with my father that had been overshadowed by the larger family dynamics, but had carried their own quiet significance. The way he'd slipped me that handwritten note years ago, acknowledging that what had happened at Thanksgiving wasn't right. His request to see the grandchildren during that first Christmas we'd spent on our own. The careful way he'd always treated me with more respect than the rest of the family, even when he hadn't found the courage to defend me publicly. I found him in room 247, looking smaller than I remembered against the white hospital sheets. His face lit up when he saw me, the same expression of relief and joy I remembered from childhood when I'd walk through the door after school. "Rebecca," he said, his voice rough but warm. "You came." "Of course I came," I said, settling into the chair beside his bed and taking his hand. It felt fragile in mine, the skin papery and cool, marked with the IV line that connected him to bags of fluid hanging from metal poles. "I wasn't sure you would, after everything that's happened. Dad, you're my father, that never changed, no matter what happened with Mom and Jennifer." He squeezed my hand weakly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've made so many mistakes, sweetheart, stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. Let your mother make decisions I didn't agree with. Let you think I didn't see what was happening." The words I'd waited decades to hear, spoken in a sterile hospital room under fluorescent lights that made everything look pale and uncertain, but better late than never. "Better here than not at all. You don't need to apologize for that now," I said gently. "You need to focus on getting better." "But I do need to apologize. I've been thinking about it for years, ever since that Thanksgiving when I watched them make you eat standing up like you were some kind of unwelcome guest. I should have gotten up from that table. I should have demanded they bring you a chair. I should have left with you when it became clear they weren't going to treat you with basic dignity." The admission broke something open in my chest, a knot of old pain I'd carried for so long I'd stopped noticing its weight. Hearing him acknowledge what had really happened, what it had meant, felt like a form of healing I hadn't known I needed. "I was a coward," he continued, his voice gaining strength with the confession. "I told myself I was keeping the peace, but I was really just taking the easy way out. And I let my daughter suffer for it." "Dad, stop," I said, but he shook his head. "Let me finish. I need to say this while I can. You were always my favorite, you know that. Not because you were better than Jennifer, but because you had this way of seeing people, of making them feel valued. You'd light up when someone walked into a room, like their presence was a gift. Your mother and sister, they never understood that about you. They thought you were performing, trying too hard, but I knew it was just who you were." I felt tears starting to gather in my eyes, emotions I'd buried under years of self-protection, finally finding their way to the
surface, and watching them systematically crush that light in you year after year, gathering after gathering, was the greatest regret of my life. I should have protected you from their need to feel superior. I should have stood up for my daughter when she needed it most. "You're standing up for me now," I said quietly. He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. "Too little, too late, maybe." "Never too late," I assured him, and meant it. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, my hand in his, years of complicated history, settling into something simpler and more honest between us. The afternoon light shifted through the hospital room window, painting everything in softer shades. "How are Tyler and Emma?" he asked, eventually. "I've missed them terribly." "They're wonderful. Tyler's 11 now, playing soccer and learning guitar. Emma's 9 and convinced she's going to be a veterinarian who also writes books and designs houses like her mom." His face crinkled with delight. "She sounds like you at that age. Convinced she could do everything, and probably right about most of it. They ask about you sometimes, wonder why Grandpa doesn't come to visit anymore. What do you tell them? The truth, that sometimes adults have complicated relationships, but that doesn't change the love underneath. And do they? Still love their old grandpa despite everything? They adore you, Dad. They always have." Dr. Patel appeared in the doorway, a young woman with kind eyes and efficient movements. "Mr. Collins, I have your test results. How are you feeling?" "Much better now that my daughter's here," he said, and the pride in his voice when he introduced me made my chest swell with emotion I hadn't expected to feel again. The doctor explained that while the heart attack had been mild, it was a serious warning sign. Changes would need to be made. Medications, diet modifications, regular follow-up appointments, a lifestyle overhaul that would require support and monitoring. Do you have family who can help with your recovery? Dr. Patel asked. My father looked at me with hopeful eyes. I'd like my daughter to be my emergency contact if she's willing. The request was loaded with implications. It meant choosing me over my mother and Jennifer, the family members who lived closer and had maintained the appearance of normal relationships. It meant acknowledging publicly that the estranged daughter was the one he trusted with his care, his decisions, potentially his life. Of course, I said, without hesitation. Whatever you need. After the doctor left, we talked about practical matters, his living situation in the big house on Elm Avenue that had become too much for him to maintain alone, his finances, which were more complicated than I'd realized, his wishes for medical care if his condition worsened. I've been thinking about making some changes anyway, he said. That house has too many memories, most of them not particularly happy ones anymore. Maybe it's time for something smaller, simpler. What about Mom? His expression darkened slightly. Your mother and I have been living separate lives in the same house for longer than either of us wants to admit. This has made me realize that life's too short to spend it pretending everything's fine when it's not. As evening approached, I knew I needed to make the calls I'd been dreading. My mother deserved to know about his condition, regardless of our estrangement. Jennifer needed to be informed. The family network that had functioned perfectly well without me for 3 years needed to be activated. Do you want me to call them? I asked. He nodded gratefully. I'm not ready to deal with their drama right now, but they should know. I stepped into the hallway and dialed my mother's number, steeling myself for whatever reaction awaited me. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the same cool formality it had held since our last conversation years ago. Patricia Collins speaking. Mom, it's Rebecca. I'm calling about Dad. He's at Millbrook General. He had a heart attack this morning. The silence that followed was so complete I thought the call had dropped. Then came a sharp intake of breath, followed by a stream of questions delivered with the rapid-fire intensity of barely controlled panic. Is he all right? How bad was it? Why didn't anyone call me sooner? Which doctor is treating him? I'll be right there. Mom, slow down. He's stable. Dr. Patel is his cardiologist. Room 247. He's asking for family. Family. Her voice sharpened with something that sounded almost like accusation. And you just happened to be the one who got called first. He asked for me specifically. Gave the hospital my number as his primary contact. Another loaded silence, heavy with implications, neither of us was prepared to address directly. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said finally, and hung up without another word. Jennifer's reaction was more predictable, a mixture of concern for our father and barely concealed resentment that I'd been brought into the family emergency when I'd made myself so unavailable for family celebrations. So now you want to be involved, she said, after I'd explained the situation. I want Dad to have the support he needs during his recovery. I replied evenly. This isn't about me wanting anything. It's about being there for someone I love who's asked for my help. How convenient that you get to swoop in and play the devoted daughter now that there's a crisis. The accusation stung, partly because it carried a grain of truth I wasn't comfortable examining. Had I been so focused on protecting myself from family dysfunction that I'd inadvertently abandoned my father to face it alone? Jennifer, Dad had a heart attack this morning. Can we maybe focus on what he needs right now instead of relitigating old grievances? Old grievances? Her voice rose with familiar indignation. You cut us off, Rebecca. You stopped coming to family gatherings, stopped participating in holiday planning, stopped being part of this family,
And now you expect us to welcome you back with open arms, because Dad's sick. I expect us to put Dad's well-being first, I said quietly. Beyond that, I'm not expecting anything. When I returned to his room, my father was sitting up slightly, looking more alert than he had all day. How did they take it? About as well as you'd expect. They'll be here soon. He nodded, resignation settling over his features like a familiar coat. I suppose I should prepare for the performance. What performance? The one where we all pretend we're a happy, functional family rallying around a medical crisis. Where old hurts are temporarily set aside in favor of maintaining appearances. Where everyone says the right things while meaning something entirely different. The cynical accuracy of his prediction was both heartbreaking and liberating. At least I wasn't the only one who saw the family dynamics clearly. My mother arrived first, sweeping into the room with the controlled urgency she brought to any crisis that threatened to disrupt her carefully managed world. She looked elegant even in her emergency rush, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expensive handbag clutched like a shield against whatever chaos awaited. She hugged my father with genuine emotion, tears gathering in her eyes as she took in his appearance against the stark hospital bedding. For a moment, I glimpsed the woman she must have been 40 years ago, before pride and control became her primary languages of love. "Robert, you scared me to death," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm sorry, Pat. I didn't mean to worry you." She turned to acknowledge my presence with a nod that was polite but distant. "Rebecca, thank you for staying with him." "Of course," I said, uncertain how to navigate this resumption of contact after years of silence. Jennifer arrived 10 minutes later with David in tow, both of them looking like they'd left important meetings to rush to the hospital. She kissed our father's forehead and squeezed his hand, her concern genuine despite whatever complicated feelings my presence might be stirring. "How are you feeling, Dad?" she asked, settling into the chair on the other side of his bed. "Better now that my girls are here," he said, looking between Jennifer and me with obvious happiness at having both his daughters in the same room for the first time in 3 years. The next hour passed in the strange suspended reality of family crisis, where normal rules and grievances were temporarily set aside in service of immediate need. We discussed his treatment plan, arranged for someone to stay with him overnight, coordinated schedules for the recovery period ahead. I found myself working alongside Jennifer and my mother with surprising efficiency, our shared concern for my father creating a temporary bridge over the chasm that had divided us. There was no discussion of our estrangement, no rehashing of old hurts, just the practical business of caring for someone we all loved. But underneath the surface cooperation, I could feel the tension building, the questions and resentments that were being temporarily suppressed but not resolved. This crisis had thrown us back together, but it hadn't healed anything. It had simply created a pause in hostilities, a ceasefire that would only last as long as the immediate emergency. When visiting hours ended, we found ourselves in the hospital corridor, 4 people who shared decades of history but had become strangers to each other through accumulated wounds and stubborn pride. "We should probably coordinate our schedules," my mother said with the brisk efficiency she brought to organizing social events. "Make sure someone's always available if he needs anything." "I can take tomorrow," I offered. "My schedule's flexible." "I'll take the weekend," Jennifer added. "David can help with anything he needs around the house." We were being civil, functional even, but the careful politeness felt more exhausting than outright conflict would have been. At least conflict was honest. This felt like a performance we were all giving for an audience of one person who was unconscious 2 floors above us. "Rebecca," my mother said as we reached the parking garage, "perhaps we should talk about the situation." The situation? Not about our relationship, not about the years of silence, not about the painful events that had driven us apart. The situation, as if it were a logistical problem to be managed rather than an emotional wound that had never healed. "What aspects of the situation?" I asked carefully, Your father clearly wants you involved in his care. For his sake, we need to find a way to work together regardless of our personal feelings. It was the closest thing to an olive branch she was likely to offer, and it came wrapped in the language of duty rather than affection. Not because she missed me or regretted the choices that had led to our estrangement, but because circumstances required cooperation. I can be professional about Dad's care, I said. His well-being is what matters. Good, then we understand each other. But we didn't understand each other at all. We were simply agreeing to perform normalcy for the sake of someone we loved. It was better than nothing, I supposed, but it fell far short of the healing I'd once hoped might be possible between us. Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending more time with my family than I had in 3 years. Hospital visits, doctor's appointments, helping my father sort through his financial papers and make decisions about his living situation. We functioned together with remarkable efficiency, united by shared purpose even if we remained divided by unresolved history. My father recovered steadily, his color returning and his energy gradually rebuilding, but the heart attack had changed him in ways that went beyond the physical. He seemed more aware of time's passage, more conscious of what mattered and what didn't, more willing to speak truths he'd kept buried for decades. "I've been thinking about selling the house," he told me one afternoon as I helped him organize his medications into weekly pill containers. "It's too big for one person, and it holds too many memories of times when we weren't very kind to each other. What does Mom think about that?" His expression grew carefully neutral. "Your mother and I are discussing a lot of changes. The heart attack made both of us realize that we've been living parallel lives for years, sharing space but not really sharing much else." "Are you talking about separation?" "We're talking about honesty," he said. "About admitting that just because two people have been married for 45 years, doesn't mean they're still good for each other." The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. My parents' marriage had always seemed like one of the few stable constants in our family's landscape, even when everything else was shifting and uncertain. "How do you feel about that?" He considered the question seriously, measuring his words with the care of someone who'd learned that truth required precision. "Relieved," he said finally, "sad about what we couldn't make work, but relieved that we can finally stop pretending it's working when it isn't." That evening, I called Michael from my father's house, where I'd been helping him clear out decades of accumulated possessions. The familiar sound of my husband's voice, warm and steady and uncomplicated, felt like coming home after a long journey through foreign territory. "How's your dad doing?" he asked. "Better. Physically anyway. Emotionally I think he's processing a lot of changes. And how are you doing?" It was such a simple question, but it hit me that no one else had thought to ask it. Everyone assumed I was fine, that stepping back into family crisis mode after years of absence was natural and easy rather than emotionally complex and exhausting. "I'm okay," I said, then reconsidered. "Actually, I'm not sure. It's strange being back in this dynamic, even temporarily. I keep waiting for someone to say something cruel or dismissive, but everyone's being so careful around me that it almost feels worse than the old honesty. Maybe they've realized what they lost when you stopped coming around, or maybe they're just being polite for Dad's sake. Does it matter which one it is?" I thought about his question as I looked around my father's living room, at the family photos that documented decades of gatherings I'd attended with increasing reluctance, at the evidence of a life built on maintaining appearances rather than nurturing authentic connection. "I guess not," I said finally. "Either way, I'm not the same person who used to accept whatever treatment was offered. I'm here for Dad, but I'm not going to pretend that 3 years of estrangement didn't happen, or that it didn't happen for good reasons." "Good," Michael said firmly. "Don't let them rewrite history just because there's a crisis." A month later, my father was well enough to attend Tyler's school play, a production of The Lion King, where my son played Timon with such enthusiasm that the entire audience was charmed. Watching my father's face light up at his grandson's performance reminded me of all the moments we'd lost during our family's fractured years. After the play, we went to dinner at Tyler and Emma's favorite pizza place, the kind of casual family outing that had become our new normal. My father fit easily into our rhythm, joking with the children and complimenting Michael on the home improvements he'd been making during the spring. "This feels like family," he said quietly as we waited for our food. "Real family, not the performance version. What's the difference?" Emma asked with the directness that made conversations with 9-year-olds both delightful and terrifying. "Real family makes you feel good about being yourself," my father said, looking at her with obvious affection. "Performance family makes you feel like you have to be someone else to be accepted." Emma considered this seriously, like when Mommy used to get sad after we visited Grandma's house. The observation hit me like a physical blow. I'd thought I'd hidden my post-family gathering depression from the children, but they'd been absorbing it all along, learning lessons about what family relationships looked like. "Yes, sweetheart," I said gently, "like that." "I like real family better," she declared, and Tyler nodded in agreement. "So do I," my father said, his voice rough with emotion. That night, after we'd gotten the children settled and my father had returned to his hotel, Michael and I sat on our back porch, sharing a bottle of wine, and processing the evening's revelations. "The kids were watching all those years," I said, still shaken by Emma's casual observation. "They were learning that family relationships were supposed to make you sad, but they were also watching you change that." Michael pointed out. "They saw you choose something better. They learned that you don't have to accept treatment that makes you feel bad about yourself, even from family." "Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh, if I gave up too easily." Michael set down his wine glass and turned to face me fully. "Rebecca, you stood in a kitchen eating dinner while your entire family sat at a table that had plenty of room for another chair. You were excluded from your own family's celebration for no reason other than their need to demonstrate your lower status. There's no universe in which protecting yourself and our children from that dynamic was too harsh." He was right, of course. The clarity that distance had provided made it impossible to second-guess the boundaries I'd set. But being thrust back into family dynamics, even temporarily and for my father's sake, had stirred up all the old doubts and programming. "I just want to make sure I'm not teaching the kids that family relationships are disposable," I said. "You're teaching them that all relationships, including family ones, require mutual respect to be healthy. That's not disposable, that's discriminating." 2 months later, my father made an announcement that surprised everyone but probably shouldn't have. He decided to move to a senior living community in our town, a beautiful facility with independent apartments for people who wanted to maintain their autonomy while having access to support services if needed. "I want to be closer to my grandchildren," he explained when he told me about his decision. "And farther from all the history that's been keeping me stuck in patterns that don't serve anyone anymore." My mother's reaction was predictably cold. She accused him of abandoning their marriage, of choosing me over the family that had stood by him through decades of shared history. She painted his decision as betrayal rather than growth, selfishness rather than self-preservation. But watching my father pack up the life he'd built in service to other people's expectations and create something new based on his own values felt like witnessing a miracle. At 72 years old, he was choosing authenticity over appearance, connection over control, love over obligation. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" I asked as we loaded boxes into my SUV for the move to his new apartment. "Surer than I've been about anything in decades," he said. "I spent too many years being afraid to disappoint your mother, to rock the boat. Afraid to choose joy over duty. The heart attack reminded me that this is the only life I get. I want to spend whatever time I have left surrounded by people who genuinely want my company." His new apartment was bright and spacious, with large windows that overlooked a garden courtyard where residents tended raised beds of vegetables and flowers. He'd chosen furniture that was comfortable rather than impressive, art that made him smile, rather than art that looked expensive. Tyler and Emma helped him arrange his books and set up his small kitchen, their excitement about having Grandpa live nearby infectious and heartwarming. For the first time in years, I watched my father relax completely, his shoulders losing the tension he'd carried for as long as I could remember. "This feels right," he said, as we stood in his living room, surrounded by the evidence of his new beginning. Finally, 6 months later, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. My father was hosting Thanksgiving dinner in the community center of his senior living facility, and he wanted our family to be his guests. Not my mother's family, or Jennifer's version of family, but the family he'd chosen based on who brought joy rather than obligation to his life. "Will it just be us?" I asked when he called to extend the invitation. "You, Michael, and the children. Aunt Carol and Uncle Frank. A few of my new friends from here who don't have family nearby. People who actually enjoy each other's company. What about Mom and Jennifer?" His pause was significant. "I invited them, they declined. Apparently they're having their own gathering at the country club." The symmetry wasn't lost on me. 3 years after being excluded from my family's Thanksgiving, I was being invited to a celebration where my presence was genuinely wanted rather than grudgingly tolerated. Thanksgiving at Millbrook Senior Living was unlike any family gathering I'd ever experienced. The community center had been decorated by residents who took obvious pride in creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. The food was a potluck combination of dishes made by various families, creating a menu that was eclectic and abundant, and prepared with love rather than obligation. My father's new friends welcomed us with genuine warmth, sharing stories about their own families, and expressing delight at meeting the grandchildren they'd heard so much about. Tyler and Emma charmed everyone by helping serve dinner and entertaining the group with songs from their school music program. "This is what I always wanted Thanksgiving to feel like," my father told me as we watched our children play cards with a group of residents after dinner. "Like celebration instead of endurance test. No one standing in the kitchen eating alone," I observed. He smiled at the reference. "Never again. Not on my watch." As the evening wound down, and we prepared to drive home, my father walked us to the car with the careful steps of someone whose recent heart attack had reminded him to pay attention to his body's signals. "Thank you," he said, hugging Tyler and Emma with obvious reluctance to let them go. "For giving an old man the family he always wanted but never knew how to create." "You created it, Dad," I said. "You chose it. You made it happen." "We made it happen," he corrected, by refusing to accept anything less than real love. Driving home that night, Michael reached over and took my hand as we navigated the familiar streets of our neighborhood. "Good Thanksgiving?" he asked. "The best," I said, and meant it completely. "Any regrets about the family that wasn't there?" I considered the question seriously, thinking about my mother and Jennifer at their country club dinner, maintaining the appearance of family harmony while avoiding the messiness of actual relationship. "None," I said. "I'm grateful for the family that chose to be there." As we pulled into our driveway, I could see our house through the windows, warm and welcoming, and filled with the evidence of the life we'd built together. This was home. Not because it was where I'd come from, but because it was where I was valued, celebrated, loved without conditions or performance requirements. 5 years after being made to eat standing up at my own family's Thanksgiving dinner, I'd finally learned the difference between being included and being welcomed, between being tolerated and being celebrated, between family by birth and family by choice. I'd learned that love without respect isn't really love at all, that boundaries aren't walls, but bridges to healthier relationships. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. Most importantly, I'd learned that I deserved a seat at the table, not because I'd earned it through perfect behavior or selfless accommodation, but simply because I existed, because I had value, because I brought something worthwhile to any gathering lucky enough to include me. And finally, after 46 years of life, I believed it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.